Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. Of the almost 200 museums in New York City, the New York Historical Society Museum is one of my favorites. Its exhibits documenting the history of New York City and the United States are not only fascinating, but are also of scale and accessible, unlike the massive, overwhelming exhibits one often sees in the city's larger museums. Its exhibits focus on issues and events that are not commonly addressed by other collections, such as the history of slavery in New York, the New York draft riots, and the city's long history of social activism. Founded in 1804, it is also the city's oldest museum and has gone through many changes in the last 220 years. And today, to tell us about its most recent changes and its plans for the future, is Louise Mirrer, who has been president and CEO of the Historical Society for the last 20 years. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, first of all, you're going through a name change.
That's right, indeed. Yeah, well, you know, we decided after many years of back and forth, practically the last, I would say, half of our existence, we've on again, off again with the hyphen in New York. That's the way New York was spelled in 1804 when we were founded, but it actually has not been spelled that way in common parlance for the last century and a half.
So it was New York-York, New-York.
Correct. And anything that, that looked like New York in 1804 was spelled New-York. The New York Times was one of the last holdovers at the end of the 19th century, also spelled New-York. So it's actually very funny because in 1945, the City Council wanted to force us to eliminate the hyphen, but obviously, tail end of World War II, there were other more important issues to deal with, and the case was dropped, and we kept the hyphen. But it's always been a debate and a discussion, and we finally decided that we should be New York the way New York is spelled today.
Now, wasn't the hyphen engraved on the outside of the carved into the outside of the building? So how'd you get rid of it?
We can't touch that. That will be part of our history, and it is indeed engraved into our building, which was, that part of the building was erected in 1904 on the occasion of our centennial. And it will remind people, as long as the building stands, which I expect will be a very, very long time to come, it will remind people that at one point, that's the way the name of our city was spelled.
Also, it's no longer going to be the New York Historical Society. Why that change?
So again, we've agonized for practically my entire 20 years at the New York Historical about the word society. For many people, it harks back to actually true roots of our institution. It was a society. It was a membership organization, and the membership consisted of elite New Yorkers. So in that respect, society has been for a very long time something that troubled us because we believe that history is for everyone, and in fact have tried mightily with our architectural renovations to make that case and make that statement. So we finally decided that society really didn't fit us in 2024 and going forward, and that the New York Historical said it all.
Sort of like they did something similar down at Lincoln Center. It used to be Lincoln Center Film Society, and they changed it to Film at Lincoln Center to make it seem more open to more people.
Right, yeah, no, it's an interesting word because, you know, in some respects, society sounds like everything we prize and admire, and it brings us together. But when one thinks about the historical roots, they really were not exactly where we're headed or aiming at today.
A number of museums and public spaces have made changes in their exhibits, exteriors, to reflect changes in the nation's values since the museums first opened. For instance, the Museum of Natural History removed a statue that was out front. It was a statue of Teddy Roosevelt on a horse, flanked by a Native American on one side and a black person on the other. Some people have criticized that for being racist and patronizing. Is that partly what we're seeing at the New York Historical, trying to update your values from what they may have been 200 years ago?
Yes, well, we did that. We did that quite a long time ago. We didn't subtract any statues, but we did add a couple, and they do reflect our values, and they certainly reflect the values of what we aspire to, we believe, as a nation. So we had no statues in front of our building, so there was no controversy. But we wanted to mark out something that said who we were, and this was with our first renovation, 2011. And we chose two figures. We always like to surprise people because that makes them learn something new, and that's interesting and tends to have an impact. So we chose actually Abraham Lincoln, who's identified, of course, with Illinois, and we chose Frederick Douglass, who's identified with Maryland. Both of them, however, we claim, and we think we can substantiate this claim rather mightily. We claim them for New York. Abraham Lincoln was made in New York. He came here, he gave his Cooper Union speech, he was photographed at Matthew Brady's studio on Broadway. Matthew Brady made him look presidential. He was, kind of a gangly looking country bumpkin. And, Matthew Brady got him to, sort of evaporate his neck a bit and have him sitting up straight, looking presidential. And imagery back then was pretty much just as important as it is today. Frederick Douglass stepped off the boat from Eastern Shore of Maryland, approximately where Stuyvesant High School is today, and became a free man in New York for the first time. He was free. In his autobiography, he talks about the feeling of walking down Broadway, no one noticing him, no one taking any notice. Just what many of us New Yorkers prize about the city still. The kind of anonymity, if you wish it. In his case, it was certainly as an escaped, enslaved person. That was a strength. So we've claimed them both as our own. We have them outside our building, and we feel that in both cases, people ask, why do you have Lincoln? Why do you have Frederick Douglass in New York? And we can explain why we made those choices. And the really nice thing is that though they had certainly had their tensions during the Civil War, Lincoln was too slow in actually doing this Emancipation Proclamation, Frederick Douglass's view. But they eventually came to admire, recognize, respect each other, and ended as close friends.
In my early years in New York, I was not particularly aware of the New York Historical Society. But then things switched, and I guess it was in the 90s that it started putting on these interesting exhibits. What was that all about, and what changed?
Well, the New York Historical went through very tough times in the 1980s and 1990s, and really had to make some difficult decisions about whether it would continue to exist, whether it might give its library, great library, one of the greatest in the world for American history, certainly early American history, whether it might give it to another institution, a university, for example.
Well, they're financial problems, correct?
Huge financial problems. And that really had to do with an outlook. Well, it had to do with a few factors, but it was, I would say, primarily an outlook that was not public-minded, had not been public-minded. The institution, the reason why we decided to do a major facade renovation in 2011 was because the building was constructed by architects who built banks, designed banks. The theory was that if you had treasures, you had to keep them from the public, or the public would harm them. So the building did not invite people in, and the institution as a whole was not thinking that history and its historical treasures should be enjoyed by everyone, appreciated by everyone. So it had become irrelevant. I mean, it was highly relevant to its members for a very long time, but as a cultural institution in New York, it had become really irrelevant. And eventually, decisions were made to bring in a much more energetic, let's say, leadership. And I was, very fortunate to have a couple of those people, both on the board and as executives as predecessors, who infused energy into the institution and seized opportunities. So that's really what began to happen.
You're getting ready to open a new wing. I think it's scheduled for 2026.
Correct.
That's a big deal. Tell me about the new wing.
So we have owned a kind of a hidden secret in New York, but we've owned a 10,000 square foot property right to the west of our building since 1937. It was purchased with the idea of expansion. The New York Historical really never had the financial wherewithal or the community support to do that. And finally, we realized that the time was right, and that we actually, every nook and cranny of our current building is occupied either with exhibits or with classrooms, or teeming with young people learning history with us almost exclusively from the public schools. So it became really necessary to exploit that huge advantage, which was this vacant property. So we decided to move forward with an expansion plan. We also decided to look for a partner. We thought that we would be stronger as an institution if we had a partnership with some other entity that was aligned with our mission. And very fortuitously, the American LGBTQ Museum was a museum without a museum. It had no physical home. It had been trying for a decade to find a vacant piece of land or a vacant building or, some way of making the museum a museum. We had just come off doing 3 exhibitions commemorating the Stonewall uprising in New York City, which really defined the beginning of the sort of official beginning of the LGBTQ+ movement as a movement. And we'd also done an exhibition on the first 5 years of the AIDS epidemic in New York City. We understood that democracy needed to be inclusive if it was to be the democracy that we value and cherish and want. And we thought that partnering, collaborating really with the LGBTQ+ Museum and sharing the building, the new wing, with them would be a great way for us, economical. We would be able to tell a story that we wanted to tell, but we would be able to do it in collaboration with another entity.
So you already had some artifacts related to the gay rights movement in the building.
Yes.
And now it's going to be
a
separate museum within the museum.
It'll be a museum within the museum. It will occupy the top floor of our new wing, but we've always been a collecting institution. We have millions, tens of millions of documents, artifacts in our collections. And really since we did the AIDS exhibition, we had been aggressively collecting around LGBTQ+ history. Because we knew at some point it would be a very important story for us to tell. We accelerated the pace with the Stonewall exhibitions, made some great new acquisitions, and we will continue to be the collecting institution. The LGBTQ+ Museum will do exhibitions. It will be, in a much more limited way, a collecting institution. We will be the main collector for that story.
And you're also going to have a rooftop garden terrace, I guess, where you could display art and you can have events when it's warm.
Indeed. So yeah, it's museums are a business like any other, and you really have to have amenities. People need them. But I think, really, on a serious note, during COVID, I think we really all discovered that outdoor space is extremely important. And we also have so many young people in our building, that for young people, you know, that kind of release. We're working now to try to cobble together the resources to do native plantings on the rooftops, so it will also be an educational space.
In recent years, if you go look at some of the museums in New York City, they are packed. I mean, there are lines waiting to get, wrapping around the block to get into the Met. There are lines of people to get into the Natural History Museum. And the same can, you know, you go to MoMA, you go to Whitney, there are a lot of people there. What has happened?
Well, I think, you know, our experience is probably indicative of what has happened. I think prior to COVID, we had a very, very robust admissions. And when we did, you know, a popular show, which was as often as we could, we would be, you know, filled to the gills, long lines. We had gone to time ticketing, which other institutions have gone to. And then COVID hit. And of course, every public institution closed. And I think in the aftermath of COVID, it was a little bit hard. People were feeling a little fragile. And it took people, you know, some time to build up the kind of psychological wherewithal to return to public spaces. But once they did, it was unleashing all of New York, all of tourists, and our museums filled again.
I think I read that you have something like 7 million visitors a year. Is that correct?
No, we have about 500,000 visitors a year. I mean, our building is, you know, 100,000 square feet right now, and you know, will be pretty much doubled in that size with the new wing. So, you know, we couldn't really accommodate 7 million, but that's a good number.
One of my favorite exhibits there, I'm going to call it the Tiffany exhibit. You see all of these wonderful Tiffany lamps and stained glass windows. Well, there was a whole women's wing, and it was the women who designed and created a lot of the Tiffany lamps that we are so familiar with.
That's right. We, you know, we were very fortunate to have this collection, which is probably the best in the world, which had been gifted to us in the 1980s by a collector who was passionate about them. But we didn't know the story of their design until a group of researchers, including one of our own curators, discovered a cache of letters from a woman called Clara Driscoll. She was originally from Ohio. She came to New York to go to art school at the Metropolitan Museum and got a job at Tiffany Studios designing these beautiful lamps. Mr. Tiffany had a whole department of women glass designers, and he felt that women were close to nature, and most of the lamps are nature themed. And he also saw that they were very fine artists. He did not discriminate on the basis of salaries that the women got. In fact, the male designers felt that they were encroaching. The women were encroaching on them and taking jobs that they should have. So they actually went on strike, which was settled. But the women, I mean, they were victims of their time. It wasn't a written rule, but it was assumed that if you became engaged to marry, you would leave your job, and that indeed happened. But the women were actually responsible for designing most of the lamps. Mr. Tiffany, though, was in the habit of signing them himself with his name. So they weren't credited until these letters describing Clara Driscoll's work. She sent letters back to Ohio to her family and described in the most meticulous terms how the lamps were designed. So we know, and now we have much more documentation, that actually it was an all-female department.
How do you decide what new exhibits you're going to create?
Well, somebody comes up with a great idea, so you might have one. In the case of the exhibitions that we've done in my time it has always been the case that someone has had a great idea. Sometimes it's related to an anniversary, but not, certainly not usually. For the most part, it's related to what is in our collections. So, for example, when I started my job in 2004, there was an Alexander Hamilton exhibition that had been planned. It hadn't opened yet. It would open a couple of months after I started. I'd had nothing to do with it at all. It was built almost exclusively on our collections. And within our collections, we had the papers of the African Free School. I think only one historian had really ever written on one of the graduates of the African Free School, David Blight, who's on our board, and he'd written about James McCune Smith, the nation's first black doctor. He had attended those schools.
Were those schools here in New York?
In New York City, and they were created by, among them, Alexander Hamilton. That's why they, were featured. The papers were featured in the exhibition. Hamilton had, along with other New Yorkers, anticipated the end of slavery in New York, and thought, well, the children of enslaved people are going to have to be educated because they're going to be taking their places side by side with white New Yorkers. So, we've got to educate them. And the schools were founded by Hamilton and others, and those papers saw the light of day for the first time, as anyone is aware, in that exhibition. And that is really what spawned the thinking, certainly on my part, that the New York Historical ought to do an exhibition on slavery in New York.
I often hear the complaint that young people today, they're not teaching them English, they're not teaching them grammar, they're not teaching them cursive writing in school, that they're not teaching civics, they're not teaching history. Do you feel that Americans today suffer from a lack of knowledge about history?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think we're ahead of the curve in New York City. The New York City public schools have made a huge effort to incorporate American history and civics into the curriculum. We've produced a lot of curricula for the public schools, and civics is a very important thread in the public schools in New York City. But I don't think that characterizes the rest of the country at all. I mean, some of the, New York is not the place where one tends to come for history lessons, but some of those places, other states, Massachusetts, Virginia, some of those other states where people think American history is really made, are much less attentive to teaching it than we are in New York. But I do think that we see, the percentage of people who vote is a direct consequence to young people not being taught about how prized democracy is and how voting is. I mean, what more precious commodity could one have than the right to vote? So I think people don't understand the struggles that over the last almost 400 years of American history, beginning with the earliest, certainly the precursors to the Declaration of Independence. And we're going to be celebrating our 250th anniversary as a United States. But over that long course of history for us, beginning with the Dutch in New York, those values that have been embedded into our democracy have given rise to the freedoms that we enjoy today. And if you don't know about them, if you don't know on whose shoulders you stand, then there's really nothing that you will value, and that's what history teaches us, to walk in other people's shoes, to empathize with other people's predicaments and plights, and to be better people.
Well, I love reading history. I love coming to the New York Historical. You also have a great bookstore.
Thank you.
You can learn a lot of stuff about New York City. Now that you're expanding, you'll have more people coming in to enjoy all of that experience.
Well, thank you. And I look forward to greeting you next time you come.
I've got to renew my membership.
I look forward to greeting you anyway.
I'm afraid we're out of time. I'd like to thank Louise Mirrer, President and CEO of the New York Historical, for joining me today. To learn about our upcoming shows, you can follow us on Instagram at one-to-one CUNY TV. And you can now watch the show on the go by downloading the CUNY TV app. For One-to-One and CUNY TV, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.